Okay, thanks for pressing the button there on your computer or phone and joining us for our conversation with Joanne Florino, uh, really about her contribution to the symposium of articles that the Giving Review had uh, on conservatism and philanthropy. The contribution of Joanne's is entitled Forego Mandates and Work to Change Philanthropy Through Excellent Grant Making. And, we'll ask her to summarize that for us in a moment. But I want you to know first that Joanne is the Adam Meyerson Distinguished Fellow in Philanthropic Excellence at the Philanthropy Roundtable, where she's with which she's been since about 2013. And before that, Joanne worked in philanthropy and participated in roundtable activities and was, I think, active. Where was that, Joanne? Where did you work in philanthropy before joining the roundtable?
So I actually worked at the Atlantic Philanthropies for 11 years. And then I was at the Park Foundation in Ithaca for 7 years. I would not describe either of those as conservative foundations. And then I moved to the Triad Foundation based in Ithaca, New York, and worked there for 10 years before I joined the Roundtable as a staff member.
Did you have season tickets to the Cornell hockey games, or did you just attend when you could?
I had season tickets for many, many years. I would say decades to the Cornell hockey games.
Okay.
Yes, that one might be one of the hardest things I left behind in Ithaca. So,
okay. Well, Joanne, why don't you tell us about your contribution to the symposium about forming mandates and working to change philanthropy through excellent grant making?
So I wrote this piece because obviously the Philanthropy Roundtable has been a defender of philanthropic freedom. And frankly, from the time I joined as a staff member in 2013, when I was the VP for public policy, we were dealing with the potential for more mandates in the areas of private foundations, specifically family philanthropy. So I've been used to being a critic of the mandates because what I found in my years with private foundations in the United States, and I want us to step back and remind people, the Atlantic Philanthropies was never a US private foundation. So we were not subject to the same rules and regulations. The regulations seem to me to be quite sufficient to get the work done at a foundation and be responsible about it. So what I wanted to emphasize in this piece was that criticism of philanthropy is maybe harsher than it has ever been before, but it's certainly not new. And you just have to go back to see what John D. Rockefeller faced when he tried to get a federal charter for the Rockefeller Foundation and the kinds of things that were said at that time. I would say the critics now, in many cases, are calling for the end of private philanthropy. And the third thing I wanted to, basically an extinction event, I think is what they're calling for. But what I wanted to remind people of was that great philanthropy happens every day across this country, and that we should work to make more of that. That if we have lost hope in our ability to use civil society for change, then we are indeed in a very, very bad space. So those were the three things that I really wanted to emphasize.
I might be cheating, right? Because I'm going to pick reform short of an extinction event, I think, because you mentioned that the regulations that exist are sufficient, but aren't they unenforced? I mean, if one adhered to the regulations as they are currently written, isn't that a reform?
And I'm going to tell you that I think that overwhelmingly, the regulations as currently written are in fact adhered to.
Yeah.
And enforcement has become much easier now that everyone is filing an electronic 990-PF. There has been a delay in getting that information out, and I know some folks have been on the warpath about that. But the reality is it's going to be much, much easier. And believe me, I warn people about this all the time. It's going to be much, much easier for the IRS to go to the grant making page, the investment page, the compensation page, and get the kind of information that was harder to get when you were dealing with actual paper copies. So I think, look, there are bad actors in every profession, every industry, every sector, but to actually focus on that, I think, is wrong. People who start private foundations are made aware very quickly of how much compliance is involved in a private foundation.
And then I kind of want, I'm wanting to define extinction event. If somebody wanted to increase the payout or something, mandate an increased payout or condition an increased payout on the benefit, is that an extinction event or?
Over the long term, for some foundations, it absolutely would be. I mean, we know there have been several studies done by Cambridge Associates, and the most recent one was done in conjunction with the Council of Michigan Foundations. And inevitably, what these studies have showed over time is that something just under 5% is the perpetuity guarantee. And since I'm saying that, I'm also going to point out that many of the private foundations that are advocating for the reforms that appear in the ACE Act are in fact private foundations committed to perpetuity. And while people did extend themselves, and certainly in 2020 and 2021, we've gradually seen a reversion back to 5%. And and I do remember Larry Kramer at the Hewlett Foundation writing a piece early in 2020 when the demands for increased payout, reminding people that if you're working on long-term issues, protection of democracy in the United States, climate change, you are looking at a period of time that is much greater than 5, 10, even 20 years. So I do think that each foundation has a mission. The trustees are the rightful protectors of that mission. And that's where those decisions about payout should rest.
So what has reactions, one to your piece and then yours to some of the others in the collection? It's kind of early, I suppose, right? But what has been the reaction to your piece, if any, and what would yours be to some of the others, or whichever ones you might want to address?
Well, I think I've been lucky. The reaction has been generally favorable. Although I did have one critic, and I can't actually went back and tried to find this, but it was either on LinkedIn or Twitter that actually started by saying that I just used a lot of nice words to defend a system that's based on exploitation, and that the trustees are certainly not the rightful stewards of the mission of a foundation, because this is, after all, public money. And I addressed that argument in my piece because it's one that we've heard over and over again. I really don't understand how people who are critical of the way Congress is currently spending tax revenue think it's going to get any better if all the money that's currently tax exempt suddenly flows into Congress. So when the same people are criticizing the defense budget and the fact that Congress is funding it, but then say even more should go into that system, I don't get it. And for nonprofits, I want to be clear, you have a much better chance of being treated fairly and with a lot of understanding by the philanthropies in your community than probably by most of the politicians in your community. So I do think that it's a false claim, and some of these mandates are going to be harmful because they're going to go well beyond big philanthropy. I talk about that. JD Vance thinks 100 million in assets is a big philanthropy, while we're actually looking at donors who have $180 billion in their coffers. And my experience with conservative donors has either been very unusual, but I don't think it is, or I'm talking to conservative donors that other people are simply not speaking with. So because I'm talking to donors who are planning to do all their giving in their lifetime, are committing to sunsetting at some point in time, are really engaged in the issues that I think we all agree are really important issues. And I think that the notion of pulling back tax exemption is a threat, not just to philanthropy, it's a threat to civil society. Tax exemption is there, in my understanding, so that the government could not use taxes to destroy civil society. And I couldn't really understand if Jeff Kane was also advocating that tax exemption be removed from churches and mosques and synagogues, all of which are under attack at the moment. So I think, I think we're in a dangerous territory when we're talking about getting rid of tax exemption. And I agree with Jeff that, of course, American charity predated the charitable deduction. It also predated the federal income tax. And again, the charitable deduction was put in place because of an increase in the federal income tax at the time of World War I, so that people would not be deterred from making charitable gifts during a time when their taxes were higher. There's a lot of history there, and I think people don't necessarily know that, understand it. I know that Jeff knows it and understands it. So
I'm asking you the same question, so this is sort of cheap, but would philanthropy be extinct without the exemption?
It would not be extinct, but we do know, well, without the exemption, if you genuinely believe that the whole purpose of philanthropy is to preserve wealth, then you're going to have a very distorted, I think, answer to that question. You're going to say, and nobody would ever give anymore. People would give. They may not give as much. They may give on different timing than the way they give now. They may be hesitant to give without restrictions. I think the tax deduction promotes so much charity in this country. And I want to say also that, we do support a universal charitable deduction. So we understand that tax reform in 2017 did put a new burden on middle-class givers. And if we could go back to a universal charitable deduction, the Philanthropy Roundtable wouldn't argue against that.
Yeah. Any other contributions get your attention other than Jeff's?
Well, I probably would say much about Craig Kennedy that I said about Jeff. The one that I thoroughly enjoyed, I have to tell you, is Joel Kotkins, because he is right that there has been a sea change in giving, and that, I'm a baby boomer, and I learned charitable giving from the example of my parents, who were greatest generation, and who absolutely believed in charity. We were never wealthy as a family, so we didn't, I don't even think I knew the word philanthropy growing up. But I do think that we are seeing some change in the way people give, and that millennials, who are now the biggest givers, that was just announced by Giving USA, are more likely to be thinking about impact and theories of change and getting much more involved with organizations that they may be underestimating the extent to which those organizations are going to undermine their own wealth and the system that brought them that wealth. So I'm talking a lot out here about, obviously, tech billionaires, et cetera. And I think it would be ironic if it's those who still believe in the power of private giving to solve community problems that actually rescue them from themselves, because we're entering that period of time now where the baby boomers are making their legacy gifts. And I think you'll see much more of the charity in those, although for better or for worse, a lot of those gifts are probably going to go to their alma maters. So.
Right. Okay. But you're kind of intimating that that kind of giving, which is coming up, and there'll be more of it, will not be in the category that Kotkin is criticizing, or, by the way, Vance. it'd be more, do I say charitable, or as opposed to
I think that's right. I
aggressive?
mean, I think people underestimate the extent to which foundations are global or even national, when we know that the overwhelming number of foundations tend to have geographic interests. Some in maybe statewide, some may be in very small communities. And even foundations who do national funding often also have that community side to them. The two I mentioned, very different in terms of ideology. The Bradley Foundation absolutely funds on a national level, but also funds arts and human services and education in Milwaukee. And my former hometown, the Park Foundation, which is extremely progressive, does a great many things on a national level, but also funds arts, human services, and other organizations in this very small community of Ithaca, New York. So I think that we overestimate the amount of money that's going global or national. Yes, the big foundations are playing on a global stage, but most foundations, family foundations, the foundations that derive their wealth from a business that both shaped the community they're in and was shaped by the community they're in, that's where so much giving actually takes place.
Great. Well, you know, Joanne, I think we'll probably end it there with your reference back to the home site of the Cornell hockey team. How are they going to do this year, by the way? Because, you know, Minnesota's currently ranked #1, or it has been recently.
But, you know, I think I said this to you. I believe with all my heart and soul that on any given night, this Cornell hockey team can knock out any #1 contender. They did it to Quinnipiac.
Yeah.
So tell your Gophers to be prepared.
Okay. All right. I will do that. And then thank you so much for, contributing to the symposium and doing this with us here.
You're very welcome. And I was thrilled to be asked.